So my name is Olivia and I'm the Director of Programs for the CLEO Institute, and I'm pleased to be the host this evening. For those of you who don't know, the CLEO Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Florida, and we are solely dedicated to climate education and advocacy. So through our programs and our workshops and webinars like this, we're trying to get folks to connect the dots on climate change, but also find ways that they can take action at home and in their community. So today's topic is all about climate misinformation in the media. And one thing that we do know is that the climate crisis doesn't get the coverage that it deserves. So this tiny little green slice that you see here is how much coverage on TV climate change got in 2020, sorry. Some of you might think it was because of the pandemic, but in fact, when we looked at the data from 2019, the number was only 0.9%. So not only are we not seeing enough climate coverage, but a lot of that coverage can sometimes be really hard to figure out, right? We can't tell what's reliable, what isn't. And so I'm hoping that in today's webinar, through Karolyn's expertise, you'll be able to learn some tips and tools on how to be a more discerning reader when it comes to climate change media coverage. Karolyn is an educator and a program manager at the CLEO Institute, and she's also an adjunct professor of biology and earth science at the Tallahassee Community College. In her classes, she has a strong focus on source evaluation and science media literacy, with the understanding that it's really crucial in this day and age to be able to not just find information, but to approach it with a critical eye and evaluate its credibility. So without further ado, I will let Karolyn take it away.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I really appreciate it. So we're going to call this Half-Truths and Full Lies, Tips on how to see through climate misinformation in the media. So one of the most pervasive things I hear when it comes to climate coverage is this idea that this is new information, scientists are still unsure, this isn't fully understood. And to be perfectly honest, we see this kind of denialism about all kinds of science. It's not unique to climate, but it's very pervasive when we're talking about climate change. But that's not true at all. We've actually had this idea for 125 years or so. And science is a cumulative process where we keep building on these ideas. So, for example, I have on the left a paper published by Svante Arrhenius, old-timey scientist, called On the Influence of Carbonic Acid in the Air Upon the Temperature of the Ground. So this is actually the first paper to quantify. Quantify means put into numbers rather than just kind of speaking descriptively on how carbon dioxide might affect global temperature. He argued that variations in trace constituents, namely carbon dioxide of the atmosphere, could greatly influence the heat budget of the Earth. By the way, that's another thing that I hear about people who misunderstand the climate science, that when we're talking about tiny fractions of percentages, that this won't have a significant effect. But even then, using the best data available at the time, he performed a series of calculations on the temperature effects of both increasing and decreasing the amounts of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. His calculations showed that the temperature of the Arctic regions in particular would rise by 8 or 9 degrees Celsius if the CO2 increased 2.5 to 3 times its present value. So again, that's 1896 we're looking into this. The second image on the right shows a newspaper article published in New Zealand in 1912, so over a century ago. This is the first broadly available written record that not only mentions carbon, but directly links fossil fuels to the increase in atmospheric carbon. At the time, the most common source of heat for homes was burning coal, so that's why they reference coal in particular. They noted that the blanket, which would be a reference to the greenhouse effect, would be greatly impacted in a few centuries. You can see that sentence right at the end. Of course, they didn't realize just how much the population and our use of fossil fuels would grow in the next 100 years. So there's a vast underestimate here, but I think it was still pretty far ahead of its time in terms of thinking about the effects of our actions on the global Earth systems. So the idea that this is new and uncertain, or that there is still significant controversy, is part of a coordinated campaign of misinformation from oil companies and their trade groups. The fossil fuel industry has known about the role of its products in global warming for 60 years now. Exxon's own scientists warned their managers 40 years ago of potentially catastrophic events. We can see in this report from 1954 that was presented to the API, or American Petroleum Institute, which is a trade group for fossil fuel and petroleum companies. Their own scientists, again, funded by the oil companies, told the executives, for example, those at Exxon, that the CO2 content of the atmosphere had increased by 5% in the past century. But rather than alerting the public or taking action, these companies have spent the past few decades pouring millions of dollars into disinformation campaigns that are designed to delay critical action. We can see this continuing today, where the 5 major oil and gas companies spend millions of dollars every year on climate lobbying to sow doubt in the population as to what the science says and what actions need to be taken. They advocate delay, control, or block policies that tackle climate change and the fundamental drivers behind it, which is, of course, the burning of fossil fuels. This is not new. They took a lot of, ideas out of the playbook of tobacco companies, which denied the link between their products and lung cancer in the people who were consuming them. This happened with coal companies, who also denied a link to lung cancer in their workers. And it's also, continuing with recent events with the NFL, denying the clear connection between brain injuries and chronic, inflammation and trauma that we are seeing CTE in football players. The problem is not just these companies, it's putting profits over people. So here's a good example of what that climate lobbying might look like. This was a print campaign from the 1990s. There are 2 images, and each has a logo in the bottom right corner from the Information Council for the Environment. And it sounds neutral, like it might be a government agency, a group of scientists, but it was actually funded by a trade group for electrical companies. And their aim was to reposition global warming as theory rather than fact. So this was promoted in Kentucky, aimed at who they considered to be low information voters. And they took advantage of, some of the ways that people just naturally think and process information. For example, confirmation bias. If you're worried about a problem, it's not one that you have a whole lot of control over, and it's kind of abstract as to what's going on. I'm sure you can think of a lot of problems today that fall into that category. Confirmation bias is looking for information to confirm what you want to be true. So when we have people who may not necessarily have a strong science background, they don't want climate change to be true, to be real. None of us want the climate crisis to be happening. So then people will naturally kind of look for info that will confirm that belief. And these prey on that tendency in people, sort of giving them comforting lies that delay us from seeking action that could have, prevented some of the effects of the climate crisis we're seeing today. Here's another industry talking point. that is not borne out by data. The climate has always changed. So when we look at, the data over a long period of time collected from many different sources, we can see that this is taken out of context. Yes, the climate has always changed, but it's always been within certain parameters. Sorry, not always, in the last 800,000 years, within, for most of human history anyway. And it's not gone above 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. So they take this fact that is technically true, strip it of its context, and don't present the fact that we've gone beyond those natural fluctuations. So this is misinformation because they're expecting you to draw conclusions from it that are not accurate. Another one is extrapolating from anecdotes or single experiences. So you may have heard, both in the media and maybe from people in your own life, that cold weather means, oh, I thought the earth was warming. I thought we had climate change and everything was going to be hot. Why is it so freezing cold? Cold weather does not mean the Earth's temperature isn't rising. It's because warm air is destabilizing the jet stream. The jet stream is a band of high altitude, so high up in the atmosphere, wind that is very strong and fast moving. It's at its strongest in the winter, when it has the greatest effect on weather in the more densely populated areas of North America and Eurasia. It rolls along in kind of a wavy pattern. And so with the waves holding in Arctic air, you'll get spells of cold and snow and intermittent warm-ups. But it can reach far to the south, and bitter cold Arctic air spills southward with it into areas that are not accustomed to experiencing that. The research shows that over the past several decades, the jet stream has weakened. There's also evidence that it wobbles and it can kind of get stuck out of kilter, which leads to persistent weather extremes. And that can include heat waves, droughts, and flooding, but also cold snaps. So there is strong evidence that human-caused global warming has altered the strength and path of these winds. The main principle here is that we can't necessarily rely on common sense and intuition in order to gain an understanding of these science topics, because those are highly dependent on personal experiences and lend themselves to bias. Natural phenomena are often unintuitive. It doesn't really make sense on a personal level that a warming globe would result in severe cold snaps and winter storms. But that's only taking data from one place, that's having those winter storms. When we gather data from all over the globe and from long periods of time, we're able to draw a more complete picture. But that can be a lot harder to wrap our brains around because that's simply not how human cognition works. We're used to taking our personal experiences and using that to shift our worldview. And again, they're taking that information and putting it out of context so that it's not giving you the full picture. So a really good example of this misinformation in action was some of the news coverage relating to the recent winter storm in Texas and the accompanying power outages and humanitarian concerns. So although, as Olivia showed us, climate coverage is pretty limited, let's take a look at a couple different ways that it was represented across different types of news sources and see how we can parse them to get information. This is from a local newspaper. One down, one to go. Another winter storm could dump 5 more inches of snow on the Dallas-Fort Worth. By Tuesday afternoon, another round of wintry weather is expected to move into Texas, hitting the Red River area before moving south. It's completely accurate, or accurate as far as the predictions go. Local news stories often report weather and human impact, but they don't always have a dedicated science reporter. So they're not really delving into underlying reasons why. This is great for local on-the-ground info in real time, but it can be lacking in depth. So you want to make sure that you are using multiple sources to get some of that deeper coverage, even if it doesn't tailor it, to your area. Here's another one. Historic winter storm freezes Texas wind turbines, millions without power. Nearly half of Texas wind energy production has frozen to a halt. So some sources will make the case that there's another reason for an extreme weather event, or distract from the underlying pattern of instability and intensification, like we see here. They might be treating it as a one-off event rather than part of a pattern, or in this case, making claims about local governmental responses and clean renewable energy. This is not an accurate representation of why they had a loss of power. Wind energy production was pretty minimal, and this is a distraction. Here's another one. Climate change and record cold. What's behind the Arctic extremes in Texas? So this is pretty neutral coverage, and it's from a national network. They cover the current crisis, but they do also link it back to the underlying cause. So you see what's behind those Arctic extremes. When we look at articles like this, it's helpful to check that they have quotes from a scientist, in particular, a meteorologist or climatologist. It's also a good sign if they present data from a source like NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And here's a fourth story. Snowstorms in Texas, let's talk about it. Freezing temperatures in the south and warming temperatures in the north. Something isn't adding up. I really liked the approach here because, they're acknowledging that this is unintuitive and going against what we have experienced in the past. This is from a science news website. Some examples of science news sources include Popular Science, Science Daily, and Live Science. It's not written to be read by scientists. Like you may have seen really technical articles in the past. It's written more for a general audience, but it will focus more on the underlying natural phenomena than, say, current events and politics. Science journalism is its own field, and it requires its own type of expertise to take some of these really technical concepts and explain them in a way that the average, intelligent but not necessarily trained in laboratory science person can easily understand. Many smaller newspapers or broadcast channels don't have dedicated science coverage. So this can be a really good way to check them and fill in the gaps, reiterating that you shouldn't get all your news from one source.
Kay, I know you touched on this a little bit, but can you go into a little bit more detail about how we can kind of tell some of these different types of news coverage apart and really what makes some more reliable than others?
Absolutely. The local news is still good. For example, I have the Tallahassee Democrat here where I live. What kind of local newspapers and stations, do you read and watch?
Well, I usually listen to NPR. I read the Miami Herald mostly.
Those are great for, as I said, specific tailored information, like coverage of how hurricanes will impact your area. What you want to avoid is infotainment and opinion-based pieces. A good way to call those out is to check to see if they have data, maps, charts, graphs, listing statistics. How do they back up the claims they're making? So if you see an article that is giving you some kind of absolute truth, but they don't bring the receipts, That's probably something that is going to contain bias. National news outlets often have the resources to get interviews directly with scientists, and they might even have dedicated science reporters. It is still important to check for bias on those. So, reading from multiple sources and checking for corroboration. Do other resources also have similar stances, or are there distinct different opinions that different people are going with? Science reporting is often found in a dedicated section or in science publications like the ones I listed earlier. It should include a deeper dive into the topic and directly present data.
Thanks.
So that's a breakdown of, one news story from multiple perspectives. But have you encountered sort of other climate misinformation floating around out there?
Yep.
Yeah. It's pretty common. And, it's going to take practice in order to sort of debunk them as you go. Another common tactic that they use is to sow doubt with the exploitation of uncertainty, particularly with models. So scientists are conservative, not necessarily in a political sense, although, some are, but the other definition. They're cautious and moderate. Scientists are only going to make claims once they're very, very sure. Remember, they need to back up any statement they make with a high standard of evidence. So when you see scientists on the news, they'll often couch their opinion, emphasize that it's an estimate, not a guarantee. Models are predictions and they have a range. A model is not the same thing as a psychic oracle. Changing information helps to update them, and this is a good thing. So you might have experience with this when you watch hurricane coverage. When the hurricane is way out in the Atlantic, you see the spaghetti model with lines of possible paths going every which way, or a cone of uncertainty that's very broad. As more information is gathered, the scientists are able to make the model more precise and update it to better reflect this new information. Sea level rise is similar in that it's hard to predict, and there are lots of factors that affect it. Different areas will experience it differently as well. For example, sea level rise is mainly caused by melting land ice and thermal expansion of the warming ocean, but the Gulf Stream also impacts the East Coast. It carries water from the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean across the Atlantic toward Europe, flowing away from the US East Coast. A recent study shows that the strength of the current is weakening, which can lead to greater levels of sea level rise in areas like the Carolinas. These changing estimates reflect new information and changing conditions, not past mistakes. So here's a study I was referring to. The Gulf Stream depends on temperature differentials, warm and cool. As the ocean temperature rises, it's slowing down and the water sloshes back towards the East Coast. So that leads to the sea level rise and flooding. How do we know this is happening? Well, one of the ways to reduce uncertainty is to have multiple lines of evidence. And that is something to look out for when it comes to news stories. It's a very strong indicator. When you have different fields and different experiments, and they all point toward the same conclusion, it's much more likely to be true. A slowing Gulf Stream, contributes to that sea level rise, and the modeling exact numbers becomes more difficult. This is important because, it's multiple lines of evidence from different disciplines that can reduce the difficulty of modeling. This strengthens the claim they're making. We're not relying on one scientist or even one team of scientists' interpretation here. We have geologists who study seafloor sediments, satellites that measure the sea surface level and the temperature, oceanographers who calculate flow rates of different currents. These are all independent data sets from scientists at different institutions and different countries, but they all lead to the same conclusion. So in this Washington Post article, they show, the new research cites 11 different sources of evidence. That is a green flag to watch out for. But, we talk about scientists being in agreement. And that can bump into a problem we call appeal to authority. Appeal to authority is a logical fallacy. Logical fallacy basically means the argument you're making doesn't make sense. And it states that because a certain person or a group of people espouse an idea, that it's more likely to be correct. You might see this when people take health or financial advice from celebrities and TV personalities. It's not inherently bad to look to authorities, as long as they're the ones with relevant expertise. A climatologist has more credibility than a medical doctor, for example, when it comes to atmospheric science, even if they're both experts in their fields. And I'd definitely ask the medical doctor about, say, diet and nutrition. Scientific consensus is a particular type of authority that comes from the conclusions drawn from years worth of data from many fields. When we say scientific consensus, we're not referring to the personal opinions of the scientists, but on this accumulated data from experiments, measurements, calculations, predictive models. I have heard of people counter this by claiming that there is a mob mentality in science and that dissenting opinions are not allowed. They get ostracized. This is not true. I've been to scientific conferences. They argue a lot. And papers that come to different conclusions are published frequently. However, many of the ones relating to climate are later shown to have poor methodology, or their scope was limited and they were reported improperly in the media. Showing cooler weather in one area does not discount warming on a global scale, for example. Scientific communities value dissent, but they have rigorous standards for the evidence presented. The majority of evidence collected by meteorologists and other practicing researchers points toward anthropogenic climate change. Being open-minded means that we are willing to consider all the evidence, not accepting claims without any.
Okay, before you continue, because this is something that's come up in a lot of our climate speakers network, is how do we figure out the affiliations and motives of certain scientists? Some, a few of our students have talked about scientists that were paid off by the fossil fuel industry. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that is the case, that not every scientist acts in the interest of the greater scientific community and, humanity in general. You might need to do a little bit of digging to figure this out. A science reporter will usually note the credentials and the affiliation of the person they're interviewing. Do they work for a research institution, a government agency, or a university? Do they work in a certain industry? What's their expertise? Now, this doesn't necessarily tell you 100% what's going on. We saw back at the beginning of this talk that there were scientists working for Exxon who were straight up telling the execs that their product was harmful. This article from The Guardian is looking at the production of biofuels by some of these oil companies, although they definitely overhype that compared to how much they're producing via conventional fossil fuels. Some outlets will interview someone who has a degree in a different field but no climate expertise. Their title, maybe they do have a doctorate. It can make them sound like they have more knowledge than they do. It's often a good idea to search for some additional information if the claims being made trigger your nonsense detectors. So, looking at 1, 2, 3, are they presenting you with data that the scientists themselves generated? Can we find this corroboration? Does it sound too good to be true? If we're talking about an industry scientist making these claims. There are groups that sound legitimate, but are fronts for industry-sponsored misinformation. For example, the Global Warming Policy Foundation. they published a list of studies that claimed the consensus on climate change was incorrect. The authors of this list claim that it includes more than 900 peer-reviewed scientific papers which question human-forced climate change. And of course, once this claim was made, it was repeated on blogs, on various news media, on their own website. If you look into it more deeply, though, 9 of the 10 most prolific authors have links to Exxon. So unfortunately, Ask a Scientist is not bulletproof. You still need to use your own critical thinking capabilities. You might need to do some additional research. But, we're going to continue to practice them and hone these skills. There are some common fallacies that are often ways that people can sort of fall into traps here, like with fake experts. Logical fallacies, we touched on those, impossible expectations of evidence, cherry picking data, and outright conspiracy theories are all common fallacies in climate misinformation. There's so much more to science and media literacy and to critical thinking than what we've covered in this talk. I've spent the last 15 years of my life studying this and practicing, as well as using helpful educational resources, some of which we'll send out in our follow-up, to help refine my thinking. Refine my thinking, this refers to metacognition. It means thinking about how you think. It's a learned skill, not an innate ability. I did not come into science having this kind of perspective. And I'll tell you this much, calling out your own biases and motivated reasoning is even harder than recognizing it in others. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email with some of these resources, and there will be more webinars like this in the future that cover some of these fallacies. How do you spot them, and how do you counter them? And at that, I'm going to hand it back off to Olivia.
Thanks, Kay. That was awesome. I'm already kind of noticing a few things that I've done in the past, and I also have some biases when it comes to reading about climate change. But before we get into the Q&A section, I just want to let everyone know that it is Earth Month. Today is the 1st of April. So happy Earth Month to everybody. CLEO has a lot of events coming up, a lot of collaborative events. I just want to point out next week on April 7th from 6 to 7:30, we have Global Dialogue, and we're going to be talking about climate solutions, a just transition. We're inviting a lot of our youth Gen CLEO folks to speak about some of these topics. This is open to everybody, and you can jump on our website and find the link, and I'll drop that link soon. And at the end of this month, to kind of close out Earth Month, I'm going to be providing a very kind of general overview on how the climate crisis is impacting our biodiversity. So we hope some of you can make time for those webinars, but if you register, no matter what, you'll get the link, even if you weren't able to attend. And I also just want to flag that the CLEO Institute has the CLEO Speakers Network, and this is a really amazing program. It's free of charge. It's offered completely online, so you can take it from anywhere in the United States. We've had folks from outside of Florida join us for several of our cohorts. We just finished our spring cohort and we certified 40 students. So this is about learning how to become a better climate communicator. And there's several folks on this webinar today that are graduates of the program and who can attest to how valuable this program can be. So it doesn't matter if you're an educator already, or you're retired, or you're in the finance world, it doesn't matter. This program is aimed at just giving you the tools, providing you with a PowerPoint, and also providing some communication tools. And the webinar that we did today with Kay is also kind of building on these communication tools, becoming more discerning when we look and search for climate change news in the media. Some of us get it from social media, some of us from the TV, the radio, newsprint. So this is kind of going to be a part of a series that Kay is going to be putting together in, maybe quarterly, so we can talk a little bit more about some of these issues. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'm going to drop those links in the chat. Let me do that right now so everyone can see. So there you have our CLEO Speakers Network sign up, as well as our events page where you can join us for any of the events that we have coming up in April. One question, I'm going to start, Kay. The first question is from Mr. Lewis asking, what do you find students are able to learn about identifying fallacies after they get your teachings about this?
Okay, so I have sort of an anecdote here. It doesn't relate to climate, but I have this assignment that is kind of similar to this. It's on figuring out what is and isn't peer reviewed, how to spot some of these fake experts. And it was a little over a year ago that I did this, one of the last things I did in my classroom before we were all on Zoom. I took 3 articles about this novel coronavirus that we were hearing about in China. There were all kinds of theories about where it came from and what it was going to do. And so I had my students do a similar lesson to this, looking for credentials in the authors and peer-reviewed information. And the next class, so this was on a Friday, we came back on a Monday, one of my students said, Professor Burns, I just noticed how much of the stuff my friends and family share on social media has no source whatsoever. They say these things or they share these pictures and they don't tell you where they got the information from. And I've been calling them out on it now that I see it. So it only took this one assignment and, she didn't become an expert overnight. This was one lesson, but it planted this idea about making sure you're looking for sources and, she's going to become a more discerning reader now. So hopefully she'll apply that to climate as well. But, we saw the damage that misinformation had on the health response to COVID-19. So these skills, this is a thing, I teach this based on whatever class I'm teaching, but these skills are transferable. When you're talking about climate change or public health or, fad diets, apply these things throughout your news consumption. And it can prevent a lot of people from, say, getting taken advantage of and being misinformed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like information overload in general. So we're bombarded with a lot of stuff. Some of it's really very like clickbait, try to lures us into these sort of cheap articles. But I have there's another question here, and I think this is an interesting one because I've noticed my own biases with certain news media outlets that I rely on, which I've always sort of thought of as reliable climate change coverage. So The Guardian for one of them. How can we, is there any tip or something that you haven't really like delved into in this webinar where we can kind of be something like a tool that we can, just be a little bit more careful, because I think we tend to sort of have favorite shows, favorite networks for the news and for different things. So how can we kind of avoid those internal biases that we all have?
So you've pretty much perfectly explained confirmation bias. You already have a perspective, and then, you have those favorite sources that tend to confirm your own perspective. So media bias fact check is a great source that can kind of give you political leanings. You don't want to just rely on that. I think the best thing to do is to look at multiple sources, and you still want to make sure that the sources you're looking at are credible. So, use the tactics I showed you. Who are they talking to? The other thing is, are they, say The Guardian, do they keep talking to the same scientists over and over and over again? Or are they looking at a diverse panel of people from different fields? So that's the big thing, is you want to make sure that you're getting your news from multiple sources, from different perspectives, and you can often compare them and see, how do they portray the same information? Because you have, the angle is important. They might be giving you a completely factual article, but they leave out one important piece of information. Now, nothing they wrote was a lie, but you're not getting the full picture. So I think the best way to do that is to read multiple sources, but to use some of the techniques that we talked about today and that are in some of the resources we'll be providing, and apply them equally, both to the sources you tend to agree with and to the ones that, kind of make you roll your eyes.
Fair enough. We have another question, and this is kind of a bigger question. I don't know if you feel equipped to answer this, but it kind of touches on, at CLEO, we're always talking about taking action, and we want folks to be more proactive in their life around the climate crisis. Since there is so much bad information out there, and like, again, not just on the climate crisis, but on other topics, how can we change this? Is there something that we can do, like a place that we can put that energy toward, you know, like in terms of civic engagement? Is there something that we could do to help prevent this from happening? Or are we just kind of stuck in this giant internet world where, you know, there's so much information, it's really up to us to make those decisions?
If I had an easy, coherent answer for that, I feel like, you know, I would probably be running the world. That's a big thing to tackle. I think a lot of what you can do is, you know, do critically evaluate your own, you know, your own media consumption. A lot of those headlines, you know, when you're on social media, you know, they say, read before you share things, mention it to people. Now, when it comes to human psychology, being called out in public makes people get really defensive and they'll sort of dig their heels in. So you might want to go with more of a private message rather than commenting directly. But don't give clicks and views to these sources if you can avoid it. It perpetuates itself. Unfortunately, you know, here in the United States, a lot of the misinformation is coming from, you know, political groups, and a lot of it comes from overseas, where we really, you know, the fake news farms in, you know, other countries that are trying to destabilize the American public, we don't have much control over those. So the best thing you can do is to sort of inoculate yourself against these issues and try to spread the message about critical thinking to the people around you. Because what we need are systemic solutions here. We need reforms to like political funding, because a lot of these are, you know, funded by different political groups. I think speaking up could be really helpful. So when you know, maybe not if it's from like climate change is a hoax.biz, they're not going to listen very much. But if you have, you know, your local newspapers especially, they want to hear from you. If you notice that they're falling into these traps, you can, you know, you can write about it. So let them know, write op-eds, and demand accountability from the people giving you information.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. And again, we just have to kind of be more vigilant in general, I think, with all the information out there. This is an interesting question. They're asking if you have any tips for how environmental communicators, how they can improve climate education. It helps people, you know, understand or how to address their biases in their audience while still appearing credible. I don't know if doing that makes you appear not credible, but I don't know if how you would address that question.
So I think what we need, you know, of course, we need solid science education. So I'm always going to say, you know, more funding for science education and schools and PSAs and that kind of thing. But a good way to do that is to sort of tackle these general topics like critical thinking and science literacy. So it doesn't necessarily have to be you delving into climate. If speaking to someone directly about climate is going to kind of devalue the information in that person's eyes, choose a different topic about which that person is more neutral, whether we're talking about, you know, politically, emotionally, ideologically. You know, you could take something silly like the existence of Bigfoot and look at the coverage of Bigfoot and apply these same techniques. And then when we learn critical thinking, we can't help but start to apply it to other areas of our lives. So I think advocating for these overall techniques on, you know, science and skepticism, then, you know, you don't start in on the hot button issues, but, you know, if you can get them on, you know, if you want to stay environmental, talk about a local environmental topic that's not quite as politicized. And that could be a really good way to start. Another way to try to get people to untangle their thinking without them getting defensive is what we call the Socratic method, asking questions. So if someone says to you, you know, I see here, least favorite piece of climate misinformation is the idea that scientists are getting rich off of climate research, which if scientists and educators are getting rich off of this, like, I want my check because I'm certainly not. But rather than just shutting it down and saying, no, that's wrong, why do you think that? You know, where did you get that information? What's the average salary of a climate scientist? Where do they work? So you want to press them to examine their own thinking. You know, and if they say, you know, I got that information off of, you know, I don't want to call out specific news sources, but one that you know tends to be on the denialist side. Okay. So you know, you got it from somewhere. Where did they get that information? Or can we dig a little bit deeper? And they might not respond very well at first. But over time, if you just kind of ask these questions without trying to put them on the spot, you can kind of slowly chip away at the ideological base here. So, you know, for example, the climate scientists, you can go look up their salaries if they work for universities or they work for government agencies. You can see what grants they got. I mean, if you're into sort of full-blown conspiracy thinking, you know, that they're, you know, secretly, you know, getting secret money via Bitcoin, that's going to need a lot more effort. But, you know, if they're not super invested, you can often get them to untangle this simply by asking where they got the information and leading them through these steps without ever directly telling them your information is wrong.
That's awesome. Thanks, Kay. This is another question. I don't know if you can answer it. I know very little on the topic, but it's something that I brought up in the beginning, and they're asking about, you know, why is there such a lack of climate coverage in the media, and why, you know, considering that the problem is so huge and so urgent. I mean, some of the stuff that I've read about that is just that the demand for ratings and money has been so high, and that there's sort of, it creates competition in what gets aired, right? Especially on television, which has resulted in that tiny little green sliver that I was showing earlier. But do you have anything to add to that, Kay?
So that is a big part of it. You know, one of the science communicators that I follow basically put in, hey, you know, they showed us some of the metrics from their YouTube channel. And their videos that talked about climate had less than half the views of most of their other videos. And they got very little engagement in the ratings report. The problem with climate is that it is a systemic problem, and not even just systemic. When we say systemic problems in society, we're just talking about the humans, but this is a systemic problem of the planet. The average person doesn't have the ability to just suck carbon out of the air. It can feel overwhelming. And, you know, I need to take breaks from climate coverage sometimes, which of course you should always be practicing, you know, self-care, and we understand that. But, you know, they are chasing those ratings. And then the other problem is, you know, whenever you have someone on talking about climate change, I have a friend who's actually a news producer over in the western area of the Panhandle here in Florida. And when they air segments regarding climate, they have gotten death threats before. Of course, there really isn't much of a way to act on these, but to have a death threat over what someone considers to be a political issue when you don't really know who sent it, I can see why they would want to avoid that. You know, we've seen violence against journalists in the past couple of years. So
and
it's
scientists too.
Oh, absolutely. My old advisor had some problems with threats of violence over fishing rights, for example.
Right.
So, you know, there isn't much of an incentive to cover climate, even if it is a big issue, because people don't want to hear about it. And when you do post about it, or you know, have a segment on it, you're likely to face a lot of negative repercussions. So this is another case where, you know, you need to make it more immediate. There are still people who are under the impression that this is something that is far off and far away in terms of problems. Bring up local climate issues. You can, you know, you can call in, you can write in, you can advocate for your local stations. And when you take climate action in your community, you know, you make that newsworthy. They covered the climate strikes. If you are holding events, then those might get news coverage even where the science wouldn't. So it's one of those things where we need to demand change and accountability, or it's not going to happen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kay. That was a really thorough answer. We have several questions and it's 6:22, so I'm just going to keep taking them till we get to the end. This is a really interesting question that they're asking, can you point out or debunk one or two of the most common myths you've heard from well-meaning but misguided citizens in the progressive environmental space? So we talked a lot about today how folks are kind of skewing the climate crisis in the news, but what about the other way around? Is there anything off the top of your head that you can think of?
So, we should talk about The Guardian. I think we talked about this before. Their climate coverage is pretty good. Their biotech coverage, not so much. Europe tends to take what they call a precautionary approach to biotech, so genetic engineering, pesticides, and fertilizers. I see a lot of people push this idea of, natural always being better. The thing that I don't see in a lot of those debates is land use. Now, it's great if we reduce the use of a pesticide that was harming native insect populations. But the flip side of that is that if yields are lowered because crops are more vulnerable to pests, we have two possible outcomes here. Either more people go hungry, or more land that might have been uncultivated and left wild is turned into farmland. And loss of habitat is one of the biggest issues that these native pollinators face. So that's one of the things that I often see in sort of the progressive environmentalist movement, is not accepting the imperfections of having to, sustain and feed everyone on Earth. A lot of times these foods that come from farms that are, certified with regenerative and organic are not affordable for lower income people. So when we promote this as one of the, a sole solution, we're putting environmentalism out of the reach of many marginalized people who need it the most. So I think we need to have a more nuanced discussion around issues like genetic engineering to increase crop yields, uses of fertilizers and pesticides, and try to find a balance where we're acknowledging the needs of people and also trying to minimize harm to the environment. And, what I end up seeing is, in my news coverage, you'll see sort of the really sort of crunchy green folks who are pushing on one side, and then you'll have an agricultural economist and, a farming corporation on the other. And they don't necessarily need to be at odds. So that is one big thing that I keep seeing. And it always bothers me because I have to say, would it be better to, overcultivate one area of land and leave another forest, or to have to cultivate both and have it be organic? I mean, sometimes the answer is one, sometimes the answer is the other, but we need to be addressing this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that kind of reminds me of a quote that we used to use at CLEO is, we don't need, a million perfect environmentalists. We just need a lot of imperfect environmentalists just doing something every day, taking action against climate. It's not always about having the perfect exact piece of policy that we want to see, because we know some of those types of things can be really difficult to pass because it is a bargaining and a compromising process. So that was a really great question. Thank you for asking that, Greg. We do have time for one or two more questions. There's a lot of good ones here. Let me just see here. What is the best course of action that we have to bring this climate crisis to full light? Do you think that desire for ratings and engagement will forever hold us back?
What is the best course of action? I feel like that's above my pay grade. Trying to answer that one, but I'll give you my best shot. Well, one of the things that we'll talk about in one of our future webinars is the loss of the fairness doctrine, where the fairness doctrine is sort of showing both sides. False balance is its own issue. We'll dive into that later. But basically, this allowed for the rise of ratings-driven infotainment. So I think this is something that really needs to be addressed at the systemic level. We're talking about FCC and regulations. So as always, make your voice heard and talk to your legislators and the people who have the power to regulate these things. In the meantime, I think it's really important. Now, I could probably do another whole webinar about how social media contributes to this, but social media is a tool and it's neither good nor bad. One of the powers it holds for good is that, we can play the ratings game too. Average people can talk about this. So, as I said, trying to do newsworthy things and playing into, the corporate media and what they need for their, to show their stockholders at the quarterly meeting is one thing. But there are so many really excellent science communicators who are supported using Patreon. Follow them. The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe it's a podcast. They have a book. They've got a Facebook page. They are all user and listener supported, and they've given me a lot of these tools. I've been, following them for years and years now. So I would recommend seeking out these news sources that are not doing the ratings game and trying to support them, because then they can have a bigger audience.
That's really great advice. We're really coming down to the 6:30 mark. We don't really have time for another question, but first, Karolyn, I want to thank you. You have incredible insight and you're so knowledgeable on this topic, and I've learning so much just by being here with you. I'm so glad that you're one of my colleagues. And I also want to thank everyone who took the time out of their evening to join us tonight. Like I said, this is one of Karolyn's specialties. So we're going to kind of create a series of webinars on these kinds of techniques and tools so we can learn about misinformation in the media and how to be more discerning readers. And again, I highly encourage you all to sign up for our CLEO Speakers Network. We have a cohort coming up in June, July. It's really an easy program, and it's made for the general audience. And the more people we have talking about climate, the better chance we have of fighting the climate crisis. So I just want to thank everyone and wish everyone a good night. And if I'm not in touch with you tomorrow, have a great weekend. Good night, everyone.
Thanks again for coming out.